Aloha, welcome to the Live Ukulele podcast. My name is Brad Bordessa. Thank you for tuning in. Today, I'm going to share with you about ukulele maintenance and getting the most out of your instruments, hopefully for very cheap. There are a lot of upgrades and adjustments you can make that cost little or no money, and a lot of folks are scared to give it a whirl. So we're going to talk about some of those today to hopefully make your ukulele sound better and play better and last you for longer. Before we do that though, I want to remind you that Live Ukulele is user supported. If you like what you hear, go over to liveukulele.com/store and check out my lessons and ebooks that are over there. Or you can become a member, get access to some exclusive content, including the Play It By Ear series, where I walk through in real time figuring out a song and sharing my process and trying to let you in on my tips and tricks I use for figuring out a song. And also the strumming crash course, which is like a little baby version of Groove Ukulele, which I am working on converting still to the internet, to a web format. It's coming along nicely. It looks really great. I'm really liking how it is making the transition from ebook to web-based, and hopefully it'll make maintenance and stuff in the future a whole lot easier. So if you want to find out more about that, you can buy Groove Ukulele now, check it out with the ebook form, or you can even poke around in some of the pages that I'm adding. I've got a little preview there at the bottom of the Groove Ukulele page, but people who buy in now will have access in the future. All of my one-time payment products do give you access to new updates into the future, whatever those end up being. So you're not going to miss out if you buy now and then I update it later. It's all included, and that'll be great. I'm looking forward to how that's turning out. Had a little bit of a mess up with the website last month, and something got funny. There was a bug. People couldn't log in and access their stuff. And I spent a couple days trying to troubleshoot it, couldn't pin it down. So I moved servers and simplified my operation a lot so that there are less plugins on the site. And that's a great thing. The site is running a lot faster than it has been in the past. But I did lose access to the admin stuff for the forum. I haven't figured out how to get back into there, and I don't know how hard I'm going to try to do that. At the moment, I am bringing discussions that happened on the forum over to old school comments per page, which I think is probably a more elegant solution, even if it is a little bit more old-fashioned. But it just seems like it always works. It's predictable and it's comfortable. And to me, that's great. You don't have to go to another page to have a discussion. You can just do it right where you're at. And that's the way I'm leaning right now. So the forum might go the way of the dodo, as they say, soon. So if there's anything on there that you want to grab, you can still view it. You can still see everything if you go to community.liveukulele.com. But in the future, I'll probably try and save some costs by removing that, and we'll just go back to the comments. But right now I'm trying to preserve those old comments from the forum by moving them over to the WordPress comment system. All right, so I'm never quite sure what to bring to the podcast, and a lot of times what I talk about in my monologues is inspired by what's happening in my life. And this past weekend, I spent the day in the shop with a friend who provided a wonderful shop with a lift and a transmission jack, and we spent 7 hours replacing the clutch in my old Volkswagen Beetle, new Beetle. This is not a fancy car. This is, for all intents and purposes, a very crappy car, but I got it for $1,000 a bunch of years ago, and I've consistently put effort and work into it to keep it running because it does the trick. And I've thought, just with the way life things are changing, that I might need an all-wheel drive car soon, and like maybe I'll be looking for a new car, just buy something new and fancy and spend a lot of money on a nice car for once. But it's just so much cheaper to buy the stuff, buy the parts, and then put it in yourself. And so that's the way I've been going. That is an easier trigger to pull for me than spending 15, 20,000 on a new car that I don't necessarily need, when the old one is just as comfy for myself. It's familiar. I love it. So we replaced the clutch. And it's great. And, now maybe she'll go another 30,000 miles before the next big project comes along, which will be the timing belt, which I hear is not nearly as nasty as the clutch. But it got me thinking about ukulele stuff, because I see a lot of times that people are afraid to dig in and get their hands dirty in regards to ukulele maintenance and modifications and things like that. And the truth is that if you don't have any experience in the DIY world, it can seem very scary, but there's rarely anything that you're going to break past repair, right? It seems scary to change the strings, but the worst case scenario is you remove the old strings and you can't figure out how to put the new ones on, and you've got to take it to a music shop and they can put on the strings. Like, there's usually a plan B if something goes wrong. So I wanted to dive in and share some of these modifications and DIYs with you folks so that you can, like Abby, my new Beetle, keep it going for years and years and maybe make something that is less ideal more ideal. Oh, geez, it's squeaking in the front end. I wonder what that could be. You diagnose the problem, you find the part, you replace the part, good to go for another while. Thankfully, ukuleles only have one regular piece of maintenance, and that's strings. But there are other things that can optimize your gas mileage, so to speak, for the ukulele. Okay, so let's jump in. And the first thing is, of course, strings. You can change the strings on your ukulele. So if you've gotten an ukulele and you've never replaced the strings, gotten an ukulele from stock, from the manufacturer or from a dealer, a new ukulele, the strings are probably still the same strings that came from the factory, unless you bought through MIM or Hawaii Music Supply, the ukulele site, or what's the one in the UK? Southern Ukulele Store. If you buy through one of those folks, a lot of times they will set up the instrument, and part of the setup is checking the level of the frets and all that kind of stuff, and that necessitates taking the strings off. So a lot of times they will put on new strings from their shop. So that's really great. But if you just buy something from Amazon or from your local music store, odds are it still has the same Aquila white strings. If you buy a Kala or some other budget ukulele, it has the same strings that came from the factory. And those have probably been sitting unused on the ukulele for many, many, many months, if not many years, as it's been in storage. And they're probably pretty dead. And the number one best thing you can do to make your ukulele feel new again, or to refresh it, or to give it the room to blossom that it's never done before, is to replace the strings. It appears that I've never done a podcast episode on strings. I know I have done a YouTube video on strings, so I'll put a link to that in the podcast description. But there's lots of things to think about and discuss when selecting your ukulele strings, but actually changing them is pretty straightforward. There's really one main way to do it, and it'll vary slightly depending on what kind of ukulele you have and the hardware, the style of bridge that you have, the style of tuners or headstock that you have. That's basically the only thing that will change the procedure. As a general rule, to at least get you started if you're unsure, I really like fluorocarbon strings. I've been using Worth strings for almost 20 years. And more recently, in the last 7 years, I've been using the Ukelogic strings. Both of those are fantastic options, and they do the trick for all of my ukuleles. Some people find that they are too bright on a bright ukulele, or maybe you have a really tight sounding cheap ukulele that's just all high end and no body. You might find that something more nylon-ish will give a warmer sound, a nylon type string material. Something like Aquila or GHS or the Kamaka strings or the Pono Alohis or like whatever. Basically, there is fluorocarbon and then there's everything else. And so fluorocarbon is going to be the brightest, most articulate sound. Everything else is going to tend to be warmer from there. But it all depends. You could spend your entire life trying different string types and searching for those. But I realized fairly early on that Worth are really good. They're good enough. And the limiting factor at this point is my practice. So I kind of just stuck with Worth forever because I knew if I kept playing with it, it would just be a big time suck that could otherwise be going into practice. That will make me sound better than, it'll make me sound good regardless of the strings I use, basically. So don't get too fussed with finding the perfect string set. There's no such thing. It's going to depend on your ukulele. But in general, Worth or UkeLogic are really great. Disclaimer, they do send me free strings, but they're not paying me to say any of that. I have used them. I used them before I was ever given free ones. Maybe not for UkeLogic. I think Joel was like, hey, I'm working on new strings. Can I send you some? I was like, yeah, sure. And then I tried them out and they were really great. And I was like, hey, man, can I buy some more of those? He's like, yeah, don't worry about it. I'll just send you some more. So that's how that went. But I was playing Worth before they ever sent me free strings. Anyways, I use them because they're great, not because I'm getting paid. But when it comes to putting them on, this procedure is basically as simple as removing the old strings, carefully unwind the machine head so that the string can be pulled out of the machine head. And then you remove it from the bridge. If it's a tie bridge, which is the most common one, you just kind of slip your fingernail or the tip of your finger on the side of the knot on the bridge and kind of wiggle it until it comes loose, and you pull it up and pull it out. Just be careful not to let it scratch the top of your ukulele if you have like a gloss finish on the top. Just be mindful of that the ends can, with their sharpness, ding the top. From there, what you're going to do is you're going to basically just attach the string at the bridge. There is a fancy knot that I show in a YouTube video that I'll also put in the description. You tie it up, you pull the string across the ukulele, and you fasten it to the peg head. I believe I have 2 videos on YouTube of 2 different ukuleles, and each one has a different bridge type and a different headstock type. So between the 2 of them, it kind of covers the gamut of all the options you will see, except for pin bridges, which personally I find kind of a pain in the ass to use. They're kind of annoying, and I don't see why we need them for ukulele. Some people love them. It's predominantly Kanilea that uses those. So if you're a Kanilea fan person, that's great. No shade on that. But just from a practical standpoint, like, oh no, I broke a string on stage and I've got to change it really fast. If I don't have a way, if the bridge pin is really stuck and I don't have a way to get it out while I'm trying to blast through changing a string really quickly, that's a problem. That's where my mind goes first when it comes to fiddly little extra steps like that. Like the new Ulu ukulele that Chuck built me, it has the string through bridge. So like you can do it without any extra tools, but the fact that you got to thread it through and then get the bead and it slows things down. So I always cross my fingers I'm not going to break a string on that ukulele. That's why I play it in a band. So if I have to disappear and change a string, they can continue playing. But that's really the size of it, and you can do it poorly and just get less great results. Not from the sound of the string usually, but just like the tuning stability. If you wind the string up on the post a million times around, it's going to tend to not hold tune quite as well. So like as you get more experienced in changing strings, you want to take as much slack out as possible when you are threading the string onto the headstock so that you have the least amount of winds. That's how you get the most tuning stability. But if you can't do that, it's not a big deal. It's still going to be a lot better sounding than you were. You might just have to tune it a little bit more than normal. But also, if you're coming from stock factory strings to something that's like fluorocarbon is very stable. So even if you put them on poorly and you haven't done it before, you put them on, you're not very good at it, you don't think you did a very good job, that's still fine. The Worths or the UkeLogic or Oasis or whatever you go with is still probably going to be easier to tune, hold its tune better, and still sound better, even if you put it on wrong. So If you put it on wrong, that's one thing. If you totally can't figure it out and you get stuck, worst case scenario, you take it to a friend who plays guitar or a friend who plays ukulele or almost any stringed instrument, and they'll be able to help you figure out how to get things attached and get it up to tune. Or you can take it to a music shop and tell them like, hey, I kind of messed up. Like, I'm in over my head. Will you show me how to do this? And you hire them to change the strings with the caveat that they show you how to do it so you can see how it goes together so you can do it yourself next time. But that's the very worst case scenario. Not something to be afraid of. It can, if things do go wrong, it could put you without an ukulele for a little bit, but the odds of that are very slim. The only time you're going to really get into trouble is if you put the string on, you tighten it up, and you cut the string way too short at the tuning post. If you're a little bit newer, I would leave at least an inch of string at the tuning post, loose string, so that if the string does pull through a bit, or it pulls through all the way, you didn't get it attached to the tuning peg very well. If it pulls through all the way, you have enough string length to reattach it. I was stringing some ukuleles the other day, and I installed the strings, and I realized like I kind of cut these a little too short because taking them off and then putting them back on, there was not really enough room to comfortably do the job and to reattach them. I had to really work hard on one of them to get it to sit tight with such a short string length. So that wasn't ideal, but if you leave yourself a little bit of room, you're going to be able to reuse the string. But if you cut it too short and you can't reach the knot or get it threaded through the machine head correctly, then you're going to have problems. But that's really the only thing that's going to get you in trouble. But like I said, I've got a couple videos on YouTube that walk through the entire process. There's tons of other people who also explain it. Naturally, I think my way is pretty well polished at this point. And, I share that in the videos. It's pretty straightforward. It holds a great tune, but, there's always different ways to do something, and some other video might illustrate it just as well or better. The next thing that you can play with that is a little bit more destructive than strings, but not irreparable if you do really mess it up, is the bridge or the saddle of your ukulele. It's the saddle is the piece that you would be adjusting. The saddle sits in the bridge. It's the little white piece or black piece that sits in the saddle and that the strings cross as their last resting point before they go up to the headstock and across the fretboard of the ukulele. That saddle is the adjustment point for how high the strings sit. It's the adjustment point for the pickup contact if you have an undersaddle pickup. It's the adjustment for kind of the intonation and where that point is. It really finely adjusts the distance, the length of the scale, the length of the ringing string. If you angle the saddle back, or your pointed edge of the saddle is on the back side, the string's going to be a little bit longer than if you turn it around the other way and the pointed end is right at the front of the saddle, facing towards the headstock. Your string's going to be a little bit shorter. So that affects the intonation of the string. Usually, if you buy a budget ukulele from the factory, you get it from Amazon or wherever, the ukulele is set up to have the strings higher than they need to be. Because if they're higher than they need to be, it can make the instrument harder to play, but it's also less likely to buzz. And if it buzzes, it's very obvious, like, hey, this thing's broken. Whereas if it's hard to play, like a lot of people will just think, oh, I just don't know how to play it as well. It's hard to play. Like, this is just the learning curve. So from the factory, they tend to set up ukuleles with a high saddle, higher than it needs to be. So you kind of have two options. The first is you can take the existing saddle out and file it down. The problem with this is if you file it down and you find out that you are already right on the edge of buzzing, then you go past that point, your ukulele is going to buzz a lot more, and you're probably going to need to get a new saddle anyways. So what I would be tempted to do is you go to StewMac or something and you buy what's called a saddle blank. And it's just a piece of bone that is ready to be made into a saddle. Or bone is common for old school ukulele builders. If you have like a koaloha or something, they'll use like tusk, which is like fake bone. There's a lot of different materials. People will tell you this, that, and the other thing about which is best, which sounds best, which resonates best. I'm a fan of bone. I think it sounds fine. It does the job. It's been doing the job for hundreds of years. It's great. And it's easy to work with, right? It's bone. So when you sand it, it sands a little bit faster, a little bit easier. And then you don't have like microplastic dust in your house or in your work area that you're breathing. So I think that's an upside of bone. But use whatever you will. Get a saddle blank. And then you take the old saddle out of the ukulele and you can like make marks on the new saddle, trace it out on the new saddle so you get close. And then you bring your new saddle blank, you file it down, you carve it down. Sometimes you might have to like the other day, I had a long piece of bone saddle blank that needed to be shorter. I took a pair of like wire cutter pliers to snip it, and the bone kind of breaks. You got to be careful, like you leave yourself some room in case you crush it or it tears or anything. But you size it down to get really close to the existing saddle, and then you have a fresh start that you can experiment with. You can play with trying to find out, like, where do I want the action to be? How high do I want the strings? And you just try and match by sanding slowly and carefully. Maybe you start with 120 grit sandpaper to remove the most material, and then you jump up to 220 to make smaller adjustments. But the main thing to do with saddle adjustments is make sure you're working on a very flat surface, so your sandpaper is completely flat, and then you want to carefully hold the saddle so that you're running along with the flat surface, right? Because otherwise your saddle's going to end up being lopsided one way or another. You want to just hold it and try and get your surface to sand as smooth as possible along that flat surface. So you're going to try and retain that flat parallel movement with the flat surface, so you retain the flatness of the saddle all the way across. Because if you press too heavily on one side, you're going to sand heavier on that side, and your saddle's going to lean one way or the other. That's not going to be ideal. You want it to have as even of contact as possible, which means a very flat surface, especially on the bottom. And then usually what I'll do is I try and get the profile of the top kind of sanded approximately like where the original saddle was, which, most of the time is just kind of rounded across the top. You just give an arch to the top of the saddle, because ukulele intonation is not very precise. If it's off by, a millimeter one way or the other, like it's not going to be hugely noticeable. There might be, you might want it 1 millimeter one way or the other to be ideal, but most of the time you're not going to notice that. But you try and get that rounded profile on the top, and you do that just by leaning the top of the saddle on the sandpaper around in an arch with your wrist as you're filing back and forth across that, flat plane. And then from there, once you have the top of the saddle, you're not going to touch that anymore. You're going to move to the bottom of the saddle, and that's where you're going to remove material to bring the height of the strings down. And so what you should do for this, because now you have a new saddle that is a replacement of the old saddle. You still have the old saddle in case you mess anything up. Like that can go back in and do the job if it needs to, but you have this new one to experiment with. Then what you do is you sand a little bit, you put it in, you put the strings, you don't usually have to take the strings all the way off. You just loosen them up so they're slack, and you can lift the strings and wiggle the saddle out. Depends on what kind of ukulele you have or how snug the original saddle is and how snug your saddle blank is. You might have to adjust the thickness of the saddle blank. You don't want it to be like force wedged in the saddle slot so that it goes, like a lot of times it'll thunk, 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 thunk as the friction of the wood on the bone grips and then slips and then grips and then slips. That's too tight. But then also you don't want the saddle to lean one way or the other in the slot either. So it's a very, very small adjustment on the width. So use small sandpaper for that. But once you get it to the right width, you can just slip the new one in there, tighten the strings up, and play it a little bit and see how it feels. And if you feel like it's still high, the action's still high, you want to bring it down some more, you can loosen the strings, take the saddle out, sand it a little bit more on the bottom. This is one of those processes, like, it's okay to go really slow. If you have the time to just take it easy, you can go just a little bit at a time, reinstall the saddle, try it out, see how it feels. What you're probably going to end up doing if you're trying to get the most out of the ukulele is you sand it down too far to the point where it starts to buzz. And then from there, you're going to have the original saddle that still works. You have the too short saddle that you just made. You'll make one that is similar to the new saddle, but just a little bit bigger. And then you don't go past that point where it starts to buzz when you finalize that third saddle. It's one of those fiddly things, like, it doesn't hurt to mess with. It's interesting to mess with it. And if you don't mind sanding and just kind of sitting, it's kind of a meditative sort of a process. It's a really easy thing to try and do. To bring the strings down, which will make it easier to play. If you bring them down too much, the strings will start to buzz, and when you play harder, they'll rattle more on the fretboard. And like when the action's really low, you don't tend to get as big of a tone out of the ukulele. So it's sort of a trade-off. Like, how easy do you want it to be able to play versus how hard do you pick, and how much oomph do you want the tone to have, right? I've never been somebody who really felt like I needed the super low action. I play with a really heavy hand. You know, I'm playing in rock bands and stuff, and my technique is heavy-handed. So I tend to go for, you know, as low as you can go without that heavy-handedness buzzing. And that gives enough headroom to have a big sound and not be bogging down on a low action. But some people play really gently, and all they do is like finger pick, and you can barely hear them, and they want the action as low as it can possibly go because they're not playing hard. They're not going to make the ukulele buzz, so they can get away with a lower action. But that's something you can play with if you have that saddle blank or several saddle blanks. It's one of those things, you definitely order a couple when you get them so you have backups that you can play with and make more if you need. Of course, the other side of the setup, and like the setup of the ukulele, is how the strings sit, how the fretboard is leveled, and how the ukulele plays feel-wise. If you order from Hawaii Music Supply or MIM or a similar dealer that does the setup, you typically get an ukulele that is optimized for these things. Like the saddle height is adjusted to precisely a nice place. The nut height is adjusted to a very nice place. Those ukuleles I wouldn't fuss with because you know that they've been set up nicely. This mostly applies to more budget ukuleles that are set up on the more conservative side with the strings much higher than they need to be. There's a lot more mileage to get out of doing these mods to an ukulele that is more budget, as opposed to like if you buy a custom fancy kamaka from, you know, the ukulele site, like it's not going to need anything. It's ready to go just as is. And you'd be silly to try and mess with it because of qualified tech who's been doing setups for 20 years has already done a setup on it. Like there's no point messing with that. So this is really more applicable to more budget instruments, or instruments that just like never got the setup treatment and still feel a little wonky in the action. But the next thing you can do is you can adjust the depth of the nut. This is a little bit more scary because the nut is a little bit more sophisticated piece of kit. It has a very specific spacing of the nut slots that hold the strings, and getting those slots perfectly even is not trivial. Like that is not just something any Joe Blow is going to be able to get right. So if you goof up your nut, that might be a bit more of a setback. Like you can get a new saddle and take 5 tries to sand the perfect new saddle blank, that's not that big of a deal. But if you mess up the nut, making a new one is a lot more tricky because you got to get the string spacing right, you got to get the height right, and you've got to get the break angle of the nut slot correct so that it doesn't buzz. Because if you file the nut slot flat and the strings are entering the nut slot at an angle where they can touch other parts of the nut slot before they cap out at their ringing point, they'll buzz like a sitar. Like that's how a sitar bridge works, is it's a curved surface that slowly grabs up to the ringing point of the string. And that slow roll off is what causes the buzz of the string. It's a wonderful sound if that's what you're going for, but that's typically not what you want with an ukulele. So if you file the nut slot wrong, the ukulele, then you might be in trouble. Typically, you have two options for the nut slot. You can fold up some fine grit sandpaper and just run it back and forth in the nut slot to bring the height of the string down. Basically, what the nut controls is the height of the string at the first and second frets. Like right in that zone, that's what the nut height controls. As you get further up the fretboard, it doesn't affect that quite as much because you're pressing onto the frets, and the pressing onto the frets is adjusted by the height of the saddle. But it's very typical that these more budget ukuleles have a nut that's set up quite a bit too high, right? So bringing down the nut is a very typical modification that is needed. However, it's a little bit more high stakes. So you can either fold up a piece of sandpaper and actually file within the nut slot, or if you lift the strings out of the nut slots and put them to the side, most nuts, some nuts, depends, are not glued in. Usually, like if they are glued in, hopefully they aren't heavily glued in, because that's a component that can and will be adjusted and changed. So it's nice to be able to lift it out of its place. And if you can do that, you can approach the nut and file the bottom just like you did with the saddle. And that'll bring everything down evenly, and you don't have to worry about getting the angle of the nut slot right. You don't have to worry about throwing off the spacing, anything like that. But if you're not sure about that one, that's the main one to be kind of cautious of, because you can dig yourself into a hole and need to send it into a qualified luthier to make a new nut if that is outside of your wheelhouse. Of course, there's things like pickup installs that you can DIY, but that's a little bit outside the scope of what I'm thinking here in this episode. I'm just thinking like, how do you get the most out of an instrument that you have? Maybe it's not your dream instrument, but it's okay. You don't mind it too much, but it would be nice if XYZ was easier to play, kind of a thing. That's what I'm more imagining. Another thing that comes to mind that I did a couple years ago is I bought a Kala U bass, one of the rubber string ones. Now I have the flat wound steel string one as well. They both have a cool sound. They're very different. But for the rubber Kala, it came with perfect 90-degree edges around the top edge. It was borderline sharp. And you play it for any amount of time, and that 90-degree edge would poke into the side of your arm, and it was very uncomfortable. And it felt like, kind of like, how could they possibly ship this with such a sharp corner? Like, this is not comfortable to play. Like, all the decent ukuleles have at least some sort of a rounding around the top to make it, not sharp. It's not a knife, it's an instrument. So what I did is I got out some sandpaper, and I very carefully, to make sure I wasn't also scratching the top or the sides of the ukulele, just the top corner, I sanded and beveled the top edge where my arm comes across the top of the U bass, and went to town on the sandpaper and rounded it off, and now it's a lot more comfortable to play. The question is, around the inside of the ukulele, on those seams between the sides of the ukulele and the top of the ukulele, there is purfling around the inside, which is like, it's basically the connector blocks, if you will, that give more surface area to glue the sides and the top together. and it runs all the way around the inside edge of the ukulele. So basically the question is, if you're sanding on that corner, how far can you go before you sand through the top and the side and get to a point where you're looking at the purfling? Because what you don't want to do is you don't really want to go through the top or the side so you see the purfling, but you definitely don't want to go through the purfling because that's what actually holds the ukulele together. So that would be jeopardizing the strength of the instrument if you went that far. That said, I have thought about taking a 1/4-inch round over router bit and buzzing the edge of that ukulele to make it even more comfortable to play. Because right now it's, I don't know, maybe an 1/8 inch round over that I've hand sanded in there. But it would be nice if it was more round because it's still not super duper comfortable. And that bevel would help a lot. It would really increase the enjoyment of playing that. But I don't know how far you can go or how far you can go on that ukulele. And I don't know if I'm brave enough to try and risk damaging it in a way that, jeopardizes the structure of the ukulele. But certainly a little bit of sandpaper. Of course, this depends on like the finish of the ukulele because that spot that you sand is obviously going to be finishless. It's just going to be bare wood. In the case of this U bass, I wasn't too worried about it because it was like a satin finish where what I sanded with the sandpaper very quickly, once it got like arm oil on it, matched back with the ukulele. But if you have like a gloss ukulele, I probably wouldn't do this on like a super high-end fancy ukulele. That's just, if that's something that is going to bother your arm, that's something you need to look for when you're shopping for the ukulele. Or it's just part of what it is and part of the playing experience is that, oh, this one's kind of sharp, but that's just the way it is. I wouldn't necessarily do this on something that costs $1,000. But this U bass was, $350 or whatever, and it's meant to be a workhorse. It's meant to be played. It's meant to be beat on, and that's what I did. Created the bevel. But one more thing related to that U bass that I'll point out that kind of blew my mind because the U bass is predominantly meant to be plugged in. Like it sounds acoustic, you can hear it, but it's not anything great. It's not that loud. So it's meant to be plugged in. But when I plugged it in the first time, like the pickup was really unbalanced and some strings were way louder than others. And so that's no good. So I took the strings off and I took the saddle out to look at the pickup to see what the pickup situation was. And when I took the saddle out and looked at the bottom of the saddle, I noticed that the saddle still had the plastic mold marks on the bottom of the saddle. So there were like these round dot things, just these leftover plastic bumps that were on the bottom of the saddle. That's not good for a balanced pickup. If you want the most clear, balanced pickup sound, the saddle needs to make even contact with the pickup element. And that can be impeded by a saddle slot that's not flat. I don't really have the means to flatten a saddle slot, so I can't worry about that. But I certainly have sandpaper and I can flatten the saddle. So what I did is I sanded that saddle down so that it was actually flat on the bottom past where the mold bumps were. And so after that, it sounded a lot more even. It sounded nice. In fact, I need to charge the battery in that ukulele because I have a gig with it tonight. So basically, just be skeptical of the ukulele that you get. I mean, not to the point of like tearing it apart and thinking that it's bad for no reason, but just being aware that there are some things that do affect the quality of the instrument and the playability of the instrument and the sound that you can control. And, if you're not comfortable working on any of these things, that's okay. But I see a lot of people just not do anything with their ukulele when there are means to correct some problems. And at very least, I think that every ukulele player should know how to change their strings because it is the kind of maintenance that even if you only do it every 2 years or whatever, it is a nice boost to the instrument and to the sound that you can get from playing that instrument. And all it costs is a set of strings if you do it yourself. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully that's interesting. Hopefully it inspires you to revisit one or some of your instruments to try and get a little bit more mileage out of them and to maybe make them last longer so that you don't feel inclined like you need to buy a new one. You know, like putting a new clutch in my car, that extends the life and the usability of the car significantly. If you put new strings on your ukulele and you bring the action down to a place that's more comfortable, you might find that ukulele is really more fine than you thought and that you're happy to play it for longer and you can save some money and not feel like you need to go out and buy some nicer ukulele for no reason. That's the inspiration behind this because God knows things are more and more expensive all the time, including ukuleles. I bought my first Kamaka HF3 for $659, I think, with a pickup installed. And back then that felt like a lot of money, but you go look at what the prices are for new Kamaka HF3s without a pickup, it's absurd. So with that in mind, start poking around and learning a little bit about DIY stuff if that's not part of your comfort zone at the moment. Anyways, the Live Ukulele podcast is published on the first Saturday of every month. Next month, I'll be featuring an interview with Jessica Maeve out in Arizona. We had a lovely conversation, lovely person, and such an awesome singer. Looking forward to bringing her music to you folks. Keep an eye out for that. If you're not already, please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice. And if you're so inclined, leave a review of the podcast so that other people can see what it's about, see if it's worth listening to. I'll catch you in the next episode. Until then, be well, keep playing music for each other, and I'll catch you down the road. Peace. Ahui ho.